I'm here in a small coastal town called Pacific Grove, about 2 hours south of San Francisco in California. I'm about 5.5 hours away from my home studio. Thankfully, I did have some teas with me for teaching classes, so I'm really looking forward to this. I'm going to go right ahead and begin a presentation. I invite everyone that are joining to journey with me, travel with me to Korea. I know, like many, with the pandemic, it has been since February of 2020 that I was last in Korea. I missed my last spring, last fall, and even this spring trek. So I thought together we will travel to Korea and journey and see what we can explore together. The way I tend to travel, especially when I travel alone to source teas and to meet tea farmers and such, is I'd like to intentionally get lost, meaning I have a destination, I have some idea of what I'm looking for, but I let the trip um, organically develop. So I have some slides, and I'll go through each of the slides, and hopefully we won't necessarily move in a linear fashion, but we will perhaps meander, go into a little nook and explore a little more here, or perhaps sort of hop on over on others. And hopefully what we will find at the end is an exploration and a little break away from our day and learning a little more and furthering our own individual journeys into our tea explorations. So I'm going to start with a short video of scenes from Korean tea and tea culture. Now, I want you to know that this is not going to be the high definition images you might expect. This was actually uploaded in 2007, so it's 15 years ago. Photos were taken 15 to 20 years ago or more, and so let's see. Okay, I hope that gave you a bit of a glimpse, perhaps, of scenes that of Korea you may not have seen. In fact, there's a few tea fields there that are no longer in operation. That some of those were photographed about 20 years ago. And so the next slide brings us. So we're going to do, as I said, we're going to travel to Korea and journey from one place to another and see where the slides take us. So a little bit about what Korea's teas are about, what types of teas there are, a bit of Korean tea history, tea culture, both then and what it may look like in present day, and what and a glimpse of a Korean tea ceremony. And afterwards, we're going to do a little bit of steeping. I have some teas here to share with you as well. So this slide says Korea in the world tea map. You can see that there are not that many dots on the map. There are some 65 countries now around the world that are cultivating, harvesting, and growing and making teas, both for commercially as well as in small plots here and there. But when it all started, of course, China being the Mecca, we're talking about six primary origin countries, original countries of origin, if you will. And certainly Korea was one of those countries of origin for tea. Korea has a over 2,000-year rich history. Some may wonder, why is it that we haven't heard much about Korean teas, when in fact, if you look at the map, you can see it's attached to China and surrounded by both Japan and Taiwan, and is very much part of the original countries of tea origin, and great deal of history and culture that have gone through quite a bit of ups and downs, both for internal within the country as well as external forces. Korea has always been a very desired geopolitical small nation, geographically speaking. And so it has never been really left alone. Its larger neighbors have always wanted a piece of it, or if not to control it. So we'll talk a little bit about why Korea has had that bit of an up and down, or what I call a dotted line in the tea history development. So, but so Korea, as you can see, is this little peninsula. And for those of you who don't know, if you were to combine both North and South Korea together and were to lift it and gently put it, overlay on top of the state of California where I am, there would still be plenty of landmass around it. So that gives you a bit of a sense of just how small the nation itself physically it is as a landmass. But we're talking about just half of that in South Korea. And then the tea growing region in South Korea tends to be not throughout. And we'll get to that in just a bit as well. So Korea, being where it is in the world of tea growing regions, let's talk a little bit about where Korea's tea growing regions are. So this, growing up as a little girl, one of the things we of course hear about Korea being the hermit kingdom at one point, Korea being the land of morning calm. But one of my favorite was, if you were to take a look at Korea, the entire peninsula, both north and south together, it looks like a little side view of a bunny hopping. And so you have the half part, the lower half of the bunny, which is the South Korea. Most articles, most books will say Korea has 3 growing regions. And it's perfectly correct to say that. But I believe that would be too simplified. Although it is a small growing region, although the yield is not as large as some government officials or tea growers would like, and there are just physical limitations for that. But 3 regions, if you think of it as provinces, certainly you have the Jeollanam-do, Gyeongsang-namdo, and Jeju-do. Jeju-do, anything with the word with the do at the end, it also means an island. It's both an island and the province. So 3 provinces, but to say that there are only 3 growing regions, I think would be a misleading statement. For as small of a tea growing region as it is, the history and the topography, going from just one section, for example, in Haenam, which is hit with a lot of often harsh ocean. It's a beautiful place, and a place that I often call one of my second homes in Korea. But a lot of ocean breezes and strong winds, which makes the leaf itself quite different than, for example, the leaf just perhaps now with all these spider web of highways in South Korea, roadways, just a 45 to 50-minute hop over to Posong tea fields. But you'll find that the Haenam leaves and Posong leaves are quite different. And while people don't talk about things like Gangjin area or Janghung as much, it is so embedded with Korean tea history that to omit those regions would be, in my mind, a big mistake. Certainly, when we talk about commercial tea growing regions, without question, Posong-gun in Jeollanam-do, Hadong-gun, of course, and then Jeju-do would be without question the growing regions of most import, because of the amount of hectares that are planted with tea and for commercial growing factories. Certainly, for example, Jeju-do, Osolok has 3 of the 4 of their large true tea plantations, one of the few tea farms in Korea that would be considered a plantation size. And Osolok has 4, 3 of them being in Jeju-do. And Posong, of course, has Daean-daewon, and then and nearby Yeongam area also has the 4th one of Osolok. But so again, 3 growing regions, 3 provinces, at least 4, although I think it's quite a bit more. So There are more, and there's no in particular order, but some of the names that you might keep in mind when it comes to where does tea grow in Korea. Boseong, Hadong, Jeju-do, certainly. Gangjin, Jirisan, of course, the foothills. When we talk about Darjeeling being at the foothills of the Himalayas, Hadong is really at the foothills of Jirisan or Mount Jiri. And Jinhae, which is a little bit further south and east, closer to well, actually straight down from Hadong. Hwasun, I mentioned Haenam already. Yeongam, Suncheon, Damyang, all these areas. Gwaesangri is actually part of Poseong, for example. It's literally a hop over. In fact, the next exit over on the highway from the main tea roads of Poseong. But you hop on over there, and again, the climate, topography, quite different at times of what the tea fields that are facing the ocean side versus those that are in Gwaesangri. And so plucking yields, plucking time of the year, all differs. So next time you hear Korea doesn't have a lot of tea, well, the yield is not nearly as much because Korea climatically is a little bit too cold. It's just a little bit too north, and it's just a bit too cold to have the kind of large commercial yield. But like the lovely small vineyards we all love to go finding those special gems, Korea has beautiful gems of tiny little tea farms that you will find perhaps a one little 15 kilogram roller by hand, and where they're making hand processed artisanal teas still from beginning to end. Although that is becoming even more of a rarity even in Korea as well. So now that we've talked about the regions, let me show you some photos. This is a field of Jeju-do. So here, the bottom photo is one of the tea plantations of Osolok in Seogwipo area of Jeju-do. And the one above that is very large. You don't often see in Korea tea bushes that are so high and tall. But that's very reminiscent of if you were to go to tea fields in Hawaii. Something about the volcanic soils. Just tea bushes love it. They grow tall and fast. And you look at these tea bushes and you think, gosh, 10, 15 years old. And you find maybe it's 4 or 5 years old. And then the picture on the right is representative of many tea fields in Jeju-do, on Jeju-do, I should say, that decades ago were citrus farms. But and citrus, as most people who have ever heard of Jeju-do might know, is Jeju-do is famous for all of their halabongs, their tangerines, oranges, all their citrus fruits are wonderful and rather expensive as well. But it is citrus farms that Jeju-do was famous for. But some years ago, with the tea renaissance in Korea, and because of an issue some of the farms were having, a number of the citrus farmers uprooted their entire soil system and turned the soil around and turned it into tea farms. And this would be one of them. And this is an elderly couple who they do phenomenal work, but one of the most charming things is the husband, while they were digging up and turning the soils over, they would find, of course, this being Jeju Island, a volcanic island, would find all these little rocks, little stones, I should say, of varying sizes. So just to get it out of the way, he began to stack them and create tapsas, rock pagodas. So if you go there, there are thousands of pebbles and rocks that he unearthed while he was turning the soil to turn it into a tea field. And it's now an artwork that adorns both sides of this long driveway that goes into the tea farm. And actually that's his wife. And one of the things that's wonderful about travel anywhere, but tea travel, I think those of you who are here journeying with me today, you're here because you love tea and you want to know more about tea. And one of the things you probably, if not, will very soon find out is that by and large, tea folks are welcoming. Tea folks are really some of the nicest people around. And often you travel, you start the day and you have no idea how the day may end when you start knocking on doors of tea farmers and tea folks that you have never met. And such was the case with this elderly couple. I had driven over, I had taken the car ferry over and was driving from different tea farms to others. And I happened to come across here and fell in love with the little tea farm that they had. And we got talking. And next thing I knew, she's like a mom, said, "You can't go to a restaurant for dinner. And where are you staying for lodging?" And next thing I knew, I was there for a few days, staying right with them in their home. The one on the right, that, as you can see, is a much larger. That is a tea plantation and the factory of one of the Osolok tea factories. And if any of you have a chance to visit Jeju-do, certainly you should visit Osolok. Osolok has one of the two tea museums on site in Jeju-do. Jeju-do has, among their larger tea farms, there are two, Osolok being one, that has, as part of its premise and tours, is a tea museum alongside its shop and cafe. This is when you see this river and you see this sort of rainbow looking a bridge over there. That is when you know you're crossing the river over to Hadong side. And Hadong is traditionally known as Yasengcha, wild tea fields, Mount Jiri, Jirisan, and the waters that come down from the mountain that flows out into the river. In 2003, if you were to have traveled there, you would have seen most of the tea fields would in fact have been up in the hills and the foothills of the mountains. But around 2003, 2004, with the tea renaissance at its peak in Korea, the current tea renaissance, you began to see plots along the river, plots along the roadside being seeded with tea seeds or clonals and being potted with rows and rows of teas. And so certainly Hadong area has beautiful, part wild grown as they are up in the mountains. But, you know, when human beings begin to touch, you have a combination of wild grown tea in Hadong, but you also have cultivated tea bushes. There are no longer any plots, it seems, if you are driving along the roads, along the riverbeds. There are tea fields everywhere, very different than what it looked like in early 2000, but gorgeous. This is on the top. The top photo has a view of Hadong looking down from one of the hilltop tea fields. This is just to show that Korea, as small as it may be, has tea fields in quite different areas. The one on top is a view of Baekhyangsan, or where Naejangsan area is above Damyang. And it wherever there is a temple, there are tea grown. And Songgangsa, as well as Damyang and Hadong area, those are areas where you will still see wild tea bushes. This is a posong. Posong, as some of you may know, can be at times similarly very different, but similarly in the context that it is the largest tea growing region at one point, similar to what Shizuoka prefecture was to Japan. Both were responsible for about 40% of the tea production out of their respective countries. And the woman in black, or the girl on the bottom asking for more tea, please, that would be me, right at the entrance to the Tea Plantation Experiential Museum, and where the Posong Tea Museum is. She was moved about 2 years ago, in fact. She was moved 2 years ago because they were doing a lot of construction work, and I'm hoping that she will be brought back. I loved it when they put her up there at the entrance. The one to the right of that is one of the organic tea farms that does a lot of experiential teachings during this comes springtime. You will see not only individuals but tea clubs and tea schools and busloads coming in to get the full experience of plucking and learning how to create tea from beginning to end. And that is where also TeaClassics, Tea and Food Arts Research Center, is located as well. And then this is also scenes of tea plantations in Posong. This past winter, it was one of the coldest winters Korea's had. I was told something like the most snow in about 35 years. One of on my bucket list is to be with camera and zoom lens in hand, all set up on a winter snowy day to be able to capture the tea fields as snow covers. But that's rare in Korea. When it does, it often is just a dusting. And so it's been difficult for me to capture. That's the one part of the season that I have not been able to capture yet. And then the plantation on the bottom, on the left, is a hidden gem that's been there for a very long time. But if one didn't know it was there, you would look at the front of it and go to their tea tasting room and thought, okay, well, this is nice. But behind, into the mountains, is one of the largest tea plantations in Posong, and it's quite lovely. And if you are in the good graces of the tea plantation manager, sometimes they'll give you a ride in the back of the truck, and it's an e-ticket ride, as they would say, and you can see the mist covering over the mountains coming in from the ocean in the morning as the sun breaks through, and it simply takes the breath away in every way possible. So before we get into more of the facts about Korean teas, maybe some words, some tea-related words in Korean. So one of the things that I would love for you to do, for us to be able to do together by the time we are finished with our small travel journey today, is that you can not only get a sense and feel from both the videos, scenes, and discussions about what Korea may look and feel, smell, and taste like, but also that you can walk away with some takeaways and perhaps some things that that can help further your own journey in tea appreciation and tea knowledge. So some things to say in Korean that has to do with tea. Well, first would be a good place, cha. We all know that tea is cha, te, da, and many iterations of that throughout the world. And so Korea, it's cha. And then depending on the suffix, it can be da. So cha and da, and there could be another whole workshop on just the scholastic and otherwise schools of thoughts and discussions around in Korean, that is, when do we use cha versus da? So the title of this workshop was called Journey into Korean Tea with a lifelong tie-in. Tie-in is what I consider myself a lifelong student, but tie-in literally means, or tie-in literally means tea person, or in my mind, it's more like a tea folk. And it's not just somebody who drinks tea, but to me, it has a far greater meaning in on many levels than to say a tea enthusiast or a tea master, or because to be a tea person, to be a tie-in, and to consider yourself a tie-in, in my mind, you carry the spirit of the tea. You embrace the spirit of the tea and the soul of tea, and that is, and you become one part with. And tie-ins are really nice people. So cha, ta, cha-in, tie-in, tea person, tea folk, tea leaf, chanip. Chanip for is ip is leaf, and cha is tea, so tea leaf. Tea room, 다방 or chatjip or 전통 chatjip. And there's all slight, both very distinct differences and nuance that is both attached to cultural changes and adaptations, as well as significance to why those words were changed through Korean tea history. But we'll get to that in a moment. So traditional tea room would be called 전통 찻집. 전통 means traditional. Teaware, like this, and the kind of teawares you would see from everyday to tea ceremonies, tagi. Teapot, again, this is a tagwan, as is this, is also a tagwan, teapot, versus, I think I'm going out of order, but versus something like this that could also look like a teapot, but in our case, and for the Korean tea ceremonies or tea culture, this would be known as 주전자. 주전자 basically for water vessel or a water kettle. And some of these would be sitting on a brazier of hot coals traditionally, or nowadays in a coil electrical, and that would be a hwaro to boil the water. Teacup is a 찻잔. 잔 is a cup, and 차, of course, is tea. 찻잔 is teacup. Tea bowl is a 차사발 or 다완. This would be for bowl steeping. Is definitely one of my favorite ways of steeping tea and for meditating with tea. But also traditionally, it would be for using 가루 녹차, that would be powdered green tea, or malcha as opposed to matcha, but also for Korean matcha, like Japanese matcha, are teas that are shade grown and then ground, stone ground, and then whisked in a tea bowl, 차사발 or 다완. We talked about 주전자. And then when we were talking about Korean teas, unlike Chinese teas, many of the Chinese teas, not all, but most Chinese teas where we would do a rinse process, Korean teas do not rinse. So we tend to use what would normally be considered a dry tea tray. And so in order to adjust the temperature of the water, you would first put it into a water cooling bowl. 물식힘 사발. 물 means water, 식힘 means to lower, 사발 is a bowl. Water disposal bowl is when you are doing rinsing. This is a water disposal bowl. This is all in same colors because it is part of a tea ceremony set. And then tea scoop or teaspoon, 차 수저, or 차시. So these would be all variations. Although, as you might gather, when you talk about things like tea utensils, like tea scoops and such, often between the various countries, they tend to be very interchangeable. So that what you think you bought at a tea shop in Korea or Japan may in fact be not from that country, nor traditionally attached to that country. And then tea ceremony, 다래. 다래 is tea etiquette, proprietary, or simply tea ceremony. So what's in a name? I already spoke of the differences in opinion about cha and da. And again, that would be an entire different, once I get started, it becomes very, very involved. Dabang and chatjip, very quickly. Dabang in Korean history is really interesting. Dabang literally translated means da, tea, bang, room. That's tea room. But it hasn't always meant tea room, nor would it necessarily be a place where if you were to come across one that said dabang, and certainly they sell beverages, but a dabang isn't necessarily a place you would go in and would be able to find the highest loose leaf teas, for example. Tabang at one time, um, back in the day, was an equivalent to a government ministry level agency within the royal court, specifically for the purpose of record keeping of where the royal tea plots were around. There were some 14, I believe, tasas, tea villages, specifically for the purpose of growing and cultivating and making and storing tea for the various tea ceremonies and tea consumptions at the royal court. That was called tabang. Very important. Over the years, it has meant coffee shop. It has meant a place where you can get beverages of not just tea and coffee, but of juices and other kind of beverages. And there's another wonderful historical timelines one can do from the very first tabangs of 19, believe, '02, when a Russian diplomat spouse created a hotel-based tabang for foreign dignitaries, and how that has evolved over time through the years when Korea was colonialized by Japan for those 35 years, and what happened when American GIs arrived into Korea with not just sugar, which was so much in need and appreciated, and chocolates, but they brought something called instant coffee. And so instant coffee instantly turned tabangs, where people could go and get a cup of tea and perhaps other beverages, into really a coffee shop. Um, Certainly in my time when I was growing up as a kid in Korea, that's what tabangs were. Tabang is where you went for coffee. Um, Over time, there has been some efforts by tea folks to create tabang. So if you were to go into rural areas, sometimes you'll still see tabang. But more fashionable in recent years are tea shops. They call themselves tea shops, or chatjip. Chatjip literally means tea house. And chatjip can, of course, mean not just tea service, but all different beverages. And 전통 찻집 is the traditional tea houses where you can expect to see not just loose leaf teas, but decoctions, Korean decoctions such as 수정가 to 대추차 to 오미자차 to, for whatever resonates the best with the seasons, often needing hours and hours of brewing and decoction. And so 찻집, 전통 찻집. And there are a few tabangs still that hold up as tea rooms, but more and more you will find more tea shops and 찻집s. So talking about Korean teas and the type of teas. So I know if you know anything about Korean teas, you likely know that green tea is one of the more known teas from Korea. By and large, green tea is still the largest produced of the tea types in Korea. But as much as there may not be comparable yields of tea compared to its neighboring countries, and while there may not be as different varieties as one would find in China, there are more teas in Korea than just 녹차. 녹차 literally means green tea. And while they're not equivalent to the flushes of Darjeeling, for example, it's for a lack of better way of describing it, often the four flushes of four plucking styles and for different sizes and when they are plucked, and the type of teas of 녹차 are often talked about as the four different flushes, though that's not exactly what they are. So 우전, which is actually what I'm drinking right now, my friend at Borim, this was their 고구 right around April 18th. This year was around April 7th. They plucked in April 16th. Cold winter, and that part of the area almost never is able to pluck tea leaves that early. But this year, They weren't expecting it for quite late, and suddenly they had a warm spell, and they had kogu, hecha, new crop tea. And as a consolation for me, since I wasn't over there, I was gifted some. So ujan, 작설차 is often a name that is given to Korean green teas. It's ujan, sejak, 중작, 대작. Those are the primary four. So ujan is the first of the season. It can happen just a little before April 18th, 19th, 20 is when Kogu is considered. But again, even though it's a small country, depending on where you are, parts of Hadong and certainly parts of Jeju-do, they harvest way sooner, earlier than parts of Bosong, for example, and other areas. And so quite often they're making teas in March, whereas parts of Bosong may not be making teas until early part of May. So 녹차, 우전, 세작, and 중작, middle leaf, 대작, large leaf. And then below that you have grades like yapcha and different grades that tends to be machine produced by and large, and sometimes machine plucked, harvested, as well as used in restaurants and elsewhere where you have large leaves that works if you wanted to steep it, but often are used as a boiled decoction. So 녹차 styles can be either dakkumcha, which is the traditional, most well-known of Korea. Dakkumcha is pan-fired. 정제 or 찐차, which would be steamed, and or 기계, done by 기계, which is done by machine. 수제, entirely by hand, or often now we have hybrid. We have 황차, 홍차, red tea, black tea, 떡차, rice cake tea, and 병차, which looks like this. These are hollowed out fruits, citrus that have been stuffed, and well, so that's 병차. I'm getting ahead of myself. 가루 녹차, which is the powder tea. We'll turn the overhead cam in just a little bit. 현미 녹차 is toasted brown rice green tea. And then more and more, I am hearing of people talking about this tea from Korea that everybody seemingly is discovering in recent years, called 발효차, and how sometimes 발효차 is considered to be a genre entirely of its own. So I happen to love Korean 발효차, but to describe 발효차 as a category, so you've got 발효차 or 불발효차, simply means 발효차 are oxidized or post-fermented teas versus those that are not. Until about 10, 15 years ago, it used to be people would call, instead of oolongs or semi-oxidized, you simply said 반발효차 or 발효차. And 발효차 could mean the full spectrum. So anything, technically speaking, anything that are oxidized or fermented in some cases, even for Korean teas, and would be under the category of 발효차. So 황차 is definitely a 발효차. 홍차, anything that is oxidized technically is a 발효차. There are smaller farms that, in lieu of coming up with a name, simply say this is a 발효차. There's a few that come to mind that have some really deep and wonderful 발효chas that are smooth and velvety. And but one of the teas I do want to just tap on for a bit is 황차. 황차 is to me one of the real special gems of Korean teas. 황차 is could technically be considered 3 different types of teas. So 황차, by simply using the Chinese characters and translating it, it's yellow tea. Is it truly yellow tea? There are hwangchas in Korean teas that are processed very similarly, meaning it starts off with the green tea production staging, and then it goes through a storing and wrapping process, and that is heaped together and allowed to, for lack of a better word, almost pre-composting, if you will, to allow the changing of the chemistry, and then processed and finished through. That would be a hwangcha. Most hwangchas in Korea, they're not yellow teas, but some go through a very similar process. Another hwangcha, most of what you will find in Korea, it's not an oolong tea in a traditional, it certainly does not go through a rolling process type of a rolling balled oolong style. But if you were to take the classic definition of what is a oolong, but all teas or any teas that by processing is a partially oxidized tea. So of course, we all know that oolongs can be some as light on the spectrum as possible, that you wonder, is this a green? Is this a white? But in fact, it's actually a very light green oolong, versus some that are so heavily oxidized. You taste it and it sort of looks like, walks like, and you think it's a hongcha, but it's a hongcha. It's an oolong. So if you were to look at just that definition, a tea that is processed, that is not fully oxidized, but the full spectrum, all that beautiful oxidation levels between a green and a black or a red. And so if you were to look at that, hwangcha would be a Korean style of a semi-oxidized, not a oolong, but something similar to that. And then least known and almost not made anymore is there is a type of hwangcha that would simply mean autumn tea, which I don't really see being made these days at all. So hwangcha to me are wonderful, and hwangcha in many ways, the 발효chas that I see people fawning over and loving for good reason. I love 발효chas, but the ones that I see or people are really enjoying the 발효chas, often I would say it's more of a hwangcha that is very particular to that tea maker. And as small of a country as it may be, and as small of a tea growing regions as it may be, distinctions. You go to a one tea village and a particular green tea nokcha that is made in the same dokkumcha style. You go to 10 small little tea farms that are all pretty much houses as well. And you get, you taste and you'll find 10 different styles. It's sort of like, you go to Tuscany and then you get the grandmas together and they all make the same ragu in the same style. But, you'll get 10 very distinct different notes. And that's part of the, again, the beauty of the art of making tea, the art of tea, no matter how scientifically and technically sophisticated the machinery gets, at the end of the day, there's still the art of tea making. And so 발효차 and 불발효차 simply means not 발효, so not oxidized. So 발효차 can be 병차, 황차, 돈차, those with some that actually start out as green, in a way that a shengpur aged over time goes through its own chemistry changes, and in fact goes from a green to a much darker and a deeper fermented tea. And similarly, Korea has some teas like that, kinapcha and some of the algachas and doncha and such that will in my mind can age quite beautifully, and even hwangchas to me. I love keeping even green teas, and I've been saying this for over 20 years now. Without question, some of the best green teas should be enjoyed. They change taste and profiles almost every 2 weeks. And then after about 3 months, almost like the Nouveau Beaujolais wines, they drop. But it doesn't mean they're bad. And I love aging green teas. to see how they hold up. And some become just beautiful. I have some green teas, Korean green teas, which over time taste like some of the best matchas. And you can't possibly get that when it is just made or even in the first few years. So that's a little bit about the various types of Korean teas. And this is just a look see of how people pluck teas in Korea, from ones who are having to literally sit down on the ground because the tea bushes are that small. And some of the organic tea farms, they're like little miniature ball lollipops without the stick, and you need to sit down in order to be able to pluck because it's so low. And then, of course, you have the neatly row tea bushes that you will see in other countries as well, where you have people using both handheld pruners to all the way to the very large harvesting machines. Ah, so stories, it's all about stories. Teas, every sip has so many stories. Stories of a leaf, that's Tea for Life and Stories of a Leaf, something that I said for myself, and have been using for about 25 years now. But it's all in the hands. So allow me to digress here and share a little story about this woman who I hope to meet one day. I never knew her name. This photo was taken in early 2000s, and it was in a hillside, fairly steep up in Posong, in the backside of Posong, where a young couple had taken what amounts to probably about 10 acres, 10, maybe 20 acres of land on the hills, and had started a tea farm. They didn't really know how to make tea. They loved tea, and they were learning. So they had a small little house and what looked like a little, almost a makeshift ready-made uh, storage hut, if you will. And in there, in the front part was sort of their display room, tasting room. And in the back was what you see, simply a raised bed with two walks built into it. And there was this lady. And of course, I knew what she was doing and I knew what process she was utilizing, but I had to ask. Well, she asked, she looked at me and she said, she waved me over, and she had just finished the last firing of the drying process of this particular hand processed green tea. And she asked me to put my hand out and she gave me some to taste. And if you've never tasted just fresh finished tea, it's the best crackers and it's wonderful. It's the notes just linger for hours on end afterwards. But I had to ask because if you can see in the photo, there's really no equipment there. She doesn't have an infrared thermometer reader. She doesn't have other machineries or anything else there. So I just asked, I said, you know, how do you know? How do you know? When do you know that you haven't overbaked? That it's time to take out, to toss, to cool down? How do you know? And she smiled. And I knew what her answer was, but it was so classic. I've never forgotten it. Without saying a word, she did this. She turned her hand over and she said, "It's all in the hands." Those are the only tools she ever needed. She didn't own a tea farm, but farmers like the couple that I just mentioned, they were growing tea, but they didn't necessarily know how to make the best tea. So in this case, someone like this tea maker, she would be called upon whenever, this side of the hill, sun shines, you're harvesting. Maybe this side of the hill in the same village, don't harvest for another week because the sun isn't quite there yet. So she gets called in the morning and she is what Koreans would say, 모셔다가, right? They come and they deliver her to, and all she does is go from tea farm to tea farm to tea farm and make hand processed teas. But I've never forgotten her because it was such an experience to see this woman without saying a word and answering in a way that just said it all. So this is making sejak. And I've been really fortunate to be able to make tea. I am so sad I have not been able to this year, but been able to make tea with some wonderful tea masters and tea farmers, and have had the privilege really to introduce tea making to students and to tea professionals, and to work together. This is a little bit of a look of what a Hwangcha processing, a handheld Hwangcha processing. She is a wonderful second generation tea master who runs not only great deal of tea educational programs, but also has she and her brother and her parents run a beautiful tea farm and factory and an education center in Hadong. And this is a look-see of how you would make hwangcha. And again, these are two tea masters at in Hadong. Mr. Kim, I think in English it's called buti, butangol, makes some beautiful, beautiful teas, truly beautiful teas. And he is one of those folks that are able to make hongcha quite well. Because Korea is a little bit too cool in temperature, getting the full oxidation of the deep hongchas is very hard to come by. You can do it. I have been able to pull and get some really, really beautiful fully oxidized teas. But so hongchas are often very lighter, and they're delicious, but lighter style of hongchas. Mr. Kim does a beautiful job. And then Mr. Lee here of Muesanbang, he and his brother, although they have now gone, have two separate operations, they really have revived 떡차, 돈차, 알가차, 기납차, and does these beautiful teas that 15, 20 years ago, they were one of the few that were doing tea processing that were using pour processing, and were making some beautiful bingchas. Clearly, they're not pour because it's in Korea, but really, really quite lovely, and they aged very well. Yuja Byungcha. Yuja Byungcha is this. Yuja Byungcha, and it is a tea that is a post-production. It's one of the only truly scented teas that I think is fabulous. Like many people who really delve into tea, I tend to be a straight single state or straight teas rather than blending. I can teach blending classes, but blending and scented teas aren't necessarily what I favor personally. But Yuja Byungcha, Yuja is a citron, a citrus, which after the tea has been made, citrus is hollowed out, tea is stuffed into the hollowed out citrus, and then the disc, the top is covered on, and then it is the twine, thin twine, is used to tighten it, steamed, dried for several days. And then, of course, with every drying, the citrus gets just a little bit, shrinks just a little bit. So then it's a very laborious process of then taking the twine off, and then taking a new twine and tightening it once more and going through that same process. And it's usually done between 7 to 9 full iterations before it is then set aside to age. It has a lovely, lovely citrus nose that comes through. Camellia sinensis is what we're talking about, but I have to at least mention Korea. Personally, for me, I used to say, and still feel this way, for a small country, huge consumption of anything and everything that grows on a tree, on a bush, can be plucked, can be dried, can be processed, can be added to hot water or boiled and consumed. Tisanes, herbals. Korea has some of the most beautiful herbals and tisanes in anywhere, truly anywhere. The photo on the left is one of my favorites. Actually, it's my own. Sometimes sometimes mugwort is sold. Baby leaf mugworts are sold at the markets here in California, and whenever I see it, I have to get and then make it into a mugwort tea, which is one of my favorites. And and then the one on top in the middle, that is a fully open lotus flower tea that many people might look at it and say, gosh, is there any taste to this? But in fact, it's a beautiful, nuanced, with subtle yet deep notes, that works beautifully when we do meditation and special events, because you can actually unfurl that in a large bowl, where hundreds of people with a ladle you can be serving all day long. And in fact, you can see a picture of that on the bottom. That was done at the Zurich Museum of a Buddhist temple event where I did the tea service, and the one of my favorite people in the world, Chung Snim, was conducting programs in temple food. The one on the right is taking tea flowers, Camellia sinensis flowers, and adding them into soju, Korean vodka, if you will. And then you let that meld together. And after about 28 days or so, it becomes either a cocktail unto itself or a great base for a cocktail mix. And then this is one of the Korean, if you were to go to a 전통 찻집, where ginger date tea, it's one of the most popular and default go-to, certainly in my home and in many homes, where if one is feeling a little tired, you've got a little cough, it's a little bit cool outside, many variations of this. You could do this and you could blend it with persimmon leaf tea, you could blend it with hwangcha. Hwangcha blends beautifully with a little bit of date and goji berries and such, and creates a fabulous tea that is soothing and medicinal, and good for you, and tastes delicious all at once as well. And so Korean tea history. We're not going to get bogged down with too much history here, but Korea has an over 2,000-year tea history. There is a question as to when did Korea's tea really begin. So if you were to look at books, if you were to do a Google search, in most cases, you will get somewhere in the mid 600s, 661, 631, depending on where you read, but during the Shilla dynasty, where emissaries were sent to Tang dynasty to China at the time. And when they returned, they brought back tea seeds and tea seedlings and tea plants, which were by royal decree planted up in the foothills of Mount Jirisan, which is why you will see there was, until a few years ago, I think that tree has since, well, it wasn't being seen anymore, where it will say it was the original, although many people, no one has really been able to identify where that first original trees were planted when they came back from China. And that happened during the Shilla dynasty. So many people will say, and it would not be wrong, that Korean tea culture really began around that time. However, I'm one of the folks that believe that there is a difference between when did Korea tea origin story begin versus when did Korean tea culture begin. And there is enough to believe that in 48 AD, a Princess He Hwang-ok, who is actually of Indian descent, a princess of Ayodhya, which is said to be in the northern India section. And the question then first becomes, what do you mean? How could she have brought China jet tea bushes or tea seedlings? But it is said that the her clan had, for some time, had migrated from India to Sichuan province. As we all know, Sichuan province is abundant with tea. And that when she came to Kaya, the kingdom of Kaya, or Karak, that in order to marry the founding king, King Kimsuro, that among all the various gifts brought for her betrothed, she brought tea seedlings and tea seeds, and that those were sent to be planted up in the hills of what is now Kimhae, about an hour west of Busan, the second largest city, the port city. And there they found indigenous tea plants. So you hear about Peksancha. Peksancha was not Camellia sinensis, but that supposedly they found Camellia sinensis already growing in the Kimhae area. No scholar, no one would suggest, in my thinking, that there was tea drinking, tea consumption in any kind of regularity or at all in 48 AD. But I do believe that Korean tea began with 48 AD, that Korean tea culture began when the emissaries brought back, and of course the returning Buddhist monks and so forth, that it really wasn't until about the mid 600. But that if there is a true Renaissance period, not just for the arts and literature and everything, but for tea, it would be the Goryeo dynasty period, during which tea became so prevalent in the royal courts and in the Buddhist temples. And it was really through the Buddhist temples and the royal courts that tea were cultivated, and there was a tea culture that grew in Korea. But it was the literary, the poets, um, uh, the philosophers who would gather, who would wax poetic about all things tea, drink tea, write poems, and that happened during the Goryeo dynasty. Of course, during Goryeo dynasty, Buddhism was the not only favored, but really the national religion. And Buddhism, as you know, and tea drinking were so entwined and so closely associated with each other, not just because of the ability of the chemical compounds of tea that allows for the body to relax while elevating or staying alert, helping Buddhist monks in their meditation by drinking with the aid of drinking tea. But wherever there is a temple, you will be able to find wild tea bushes growing somewhere around the worship halls or in the mountains behind the temple. Temples serve worship halls, and so it was the temples and royal courts, but the Korean aristocrats and those who wrote and sang really helped cultivate. And to a point, on one hand, in the royal court, as I mentioned earlier, a government ministry level agency called Tabang was created for the purpose of codifying and recording all the various different ceremonies in the court. Outdoor tea ceremony here, this kind of royal court ceremony for all kinds of occasions, and being able to record exactly what the yield was and which of the tea village was producing what. But it was also something that eventually, when when wedding gifts were given, tea was so considered a specialty and a rare gem that it was one of the things that was included in a wedding gift. So tea ceremony, Korean, it's called tare. Originally, when King Kimsuro Wang passed away, I'm all history says is that Kimsuro Wang and his queen, once princess that came from Sichuan by way of Sichuan from India, were both beloved king and queen. So when he passed away, successive kings began to offer memorial services, which included, in his case, not just the feast of rice cakes and fruits and whole fish and whatever else of the bounties of the area and the season, but that it included tea offerings, and that began to be known as chare. tea offerings as a memorial service for the former kings, for the royalty. Eventually, chare became known as the base for tea ceremony, and in present day, we will say tare. Again, that goes back to, should it be all cha in the beginning, or when do you use ta, when do you use cha? And that's an ongoing debate. And so Goryeo dynasty, Buddhism, royal court, it flourished. Tea flourished. And then came the dynasty, the last dynasty, the Joseon dynasty. Joseon dynasty favored Confucianism. Not just favored it, so much so that there was a concerted effort to do away with anything associated with Buddhism, and therefore tea was impacted as well. And so in many ways, so you have both religious persecution as well as the various invasions, the Hideyoshi invasion of 1592, and then Imjin War, and then of course the Japanese colonialization of Korea, during which time Japanese tea fields needing more space began to use the tea fields of Posong area in particular, and began to take over Korean tea fields to continue to harvest Japanese tea cultivars, Pishon and most namely Yabukitas throughout Korea. And then the decimation of those tea fields at the end of the war, when they needed to surrender and vacate, and as often is the spoils of such situation around the world, they not only left in a hurry, they tried to destroy everything as they were leaving, and left many of the tea fields just decimated, which sat that way for quite some time, because after that, of course, we had the Korean War and a country that went into an economic devastation. So hardly could think about the niceties of life, such as being able to enjoy and cultivate tea culture. So some of these reasons are why, where compared to other neighboring countries of origin for tea, Korea has more of a dotted line. But thankfully, there were Dains and monks and aristocrats who kept the tea culture and tea growing in small little plots and such, not underground, but perhaps taking a back seat ever so quietly until they could rise again. And that happened in the late 60s, early 70s, when Korea began to finally stand on its own, recovering much from beginning to breathe again from the sheer utter devastation, economic as well as the fabric in the country post 35 years of colonialization, as well as the Korean War. I want to show you how to steep things, and I think I'm going to run out of time. This always happens. Tea sages. All you need to know, there are 3 tea sages. The most well-known is Choi Sansa, known as the saint of Korean tea, Venerable Choi. These were folks in the folks in the end of Joseon Dynasty, through the latter part of it, in early 1800s. During the dynasty, when Confucianism was trying to do away with anything that included with Buddhism, including tea culture, these 3 unlikely of fellows, one a young Buddhist monk who would then go on to become the tea saint of Korea, sort of the Lu Yu of Korea, who wrote Dongdasong and Dasinjeon, who would have this bromance with 2 scholars of their time who had been exiled, one to Gangjin and one to Jeju-do, and they began, no social media, no smart devices, but they began this relationship about discussing and discoursing about tea and how to perfect and how to write and codify steps on how to grow the tea, how to make tea, how to appreciate tea in poems and such. Dasinjeon, the messages of the spirits, the tea spirits. Dongdasong, hymns to the Eastern tea, and in this case, hymns of Korean tea, of poems and steps on how to enjoy tea. They helped turn the Korean tea culture that at the time was being in behind the scenes, really taking a back seat and going through that period of dotted line. And they helped revive and revamp the Korean tea culture during that period. Modern day tea culture. These are tea competitions everywhere in Korea. You have children's competitions of tea ceremony, tea making, tea tasting, tea culture clubs, tea science PhD programs, tea associations, where throughout the year, all regions, as well as larger cities, have tea festivals, both thematic as well as seasonal, and competitions and classes and programs. It's wonderful to be part of. I have been fortunate to be invited, really, truly honored to be invited to judge one of the Posong, the competitions for the new teas, as well as tea ceremony competitions, national tea ceremony competitions, and so forth. And I'm always in awe. And modern day tea culture also includes tea education programs, young and old, folks that are coming from the cities, folks that are coming from around the world. Tea Research Center. This is where TeaClassics Tea Research Center is. Tea foods, we all know tea foods. If nothing else, simple as making rice with the broth. When you think you've gotten everything, you've pulled everything out of that particular tea liquor, you steep more and then use that broth to make rice or anything else with. Braising liquids for the stronger teas. You know, tea leaves make wonderful fried snacks. You've got pesto sauce that I've made with tea leaves, tea snacks. Tea leaves right on the rice. Pickled teas last more than a year and is wonderful, either vinegar-based, salt-based, or soy sauce-based. Tea connects all. And then, of course, tea as service and ceremony and rituals. Ceremonial tea rituals that brings in Hawaii, where you have the Korean and Japanese tea ceremonies combined, where I am offering the Buddhist tea offering tea to the Japanese abbot, and the Japanese tea master is serving and offering the handa to the Korean snim. People come together, people can connect and truly understand the depth of humanity, the beauty of humanity through a single sharing of a cup of tea. Then Korean dare, there are many different ceremonies, but notably ladies' tea ceremony, gyubang dare or nebang dare, 선비 dare, scholars' tea ceremony, 궁중 dare, royal court tea ceremony, handa, Buddhist tea offering ceremony, and then of course daily tea service. I'm gonna see if we have time to just show you this. I think we may have to eat a little bit into the Q&A. Now, this would not be considered a formal, full-on tea ceremony. First of all, I would not be using a simple 떡pan like this, or table. It would be with an assistant, with guests. Often one hears of how Korean tea ceremony is more natural and more one with nature. Does not mean Korean tea ceremony cannot be very codified and very formal as well. If one were to go into the formality side of tea ceremony, you would know as the host, you would know how many days, not too many, not too in advance, and not too short of a notice, how many days you must send out a written invitation. And those receiving the invitation certainly would know the proper etiquette, thus dare, proper etiquette of how to respond. And upon arriving at the home, for the tea ceremony or wherever the location, you would know that where your position would be. For example, if this was a work-related colleagues, if it was age, because of age, one would know if you were the most senior of the guest or that you were the junior. And if so, then you would know how to enter and in what order, who would follow whom, and where to be seated. All of that are things that would be expected of a formal tea ceremony participants, from the host, Pengju, to Domi, the assistant, to all of the guests. And it would have snack tables that would come out, as well as um, small tables for the tea service. It may begin with the Pengju or the host steeping the first infusion round, and then taking the tray of the tea to the guest for the service for the first, and remaining, and with the assistant then continuing with the second and the third infusion and service. And with the second infusion, first would always be about appreciating and being one and meditating with tea. And with the second infusion is when snacks that wouldn't overtake, that wouldn't be too loud, um, because it is about revering and honoring and appreciating the tea. And that's when the snacks would come out, would be with the second infusion. You would also know how to retrieve in what order, so that there could never be a mistake of mixing up whose cup belonged to whom. And what you begin, you close out. By that, I mean you start, you serve, you retrieve, and place back in its rightful places. And in some cases, if you were to go full on, included in the ceremony itself would be how to do the cleaning of the teaware. What you are seeing here is a demonstration of an abridged tea ceremony service that shows all of the steps that would be involved, but not the first, not the second, not the full-on 3 infusions, nor are there guests. And I think often you will see people talking about tea ceremonies when in fact what you are seeing is a tea service. There is a difference between a tea service and a tea ceremony. Certainly there are many that can be considered a tea ceremonial style service. This would be an abridged tea ceremony demonstration, but definitely not a full-on tea ceremony. So let's turn on the overhead. This is a yuginong, which is organic yuginong hecha or chat ujan nokcha that came from Borimjeda in Bosang or in Kasangli area. And they were so delighted because, again, tea is usually not harvested that early on. This one was completed on April the 17th of this year. And it's the one actually I've been drinking throughout because it's so lovely and soft. It's very, very soft. And I've been steeping multiple infusions, and it really has remained beautifully. This is from a, well, to give you an idea of the difference. So these are both green teas. One is very, very fine and somewhat curly. And the other here, this is from Buttangol, Master Kim Jong-yeol from Hadong. And this is from behind his home and artisanal tea studio up in the mountains. These are wild grown green tea, quite different. And then this is actually a hongcha. And this is made very much in the style of a Korean Hongcha, but this is my tea that I made last year using tea leaves here in the US of A. My friends in Mississippi were so generous and kind, knowing how much I missed not being at that origin, sent me leaves. And I went to town and had so much fun for 2 weeks making teas in every style. And that was I was able to pull and get as much of a full oxidation. And that's very much a Korean style made Hongcha. This, as I mentioned earlier, is a 유자병차. And the way I just opened one up earlier, I must have left it there. And this one, if you were to push down very hard, it will crack open, untie the twine, and then you can store it in a little tea caddy, which is known as chaho or chatong in Korean. And then a little bit goes a long ways. And very quickly, this is a cha, mugwort. It's almost airy. And this is to do mugwort tea properly, it is very, very laborious. Why? Because mugwort usually comes up before the tea bushes, before the tea flushes come up. They tend to be right on the ground. So there's a lot of dirt in them. And so to create good mugwort, you have to go through a number of rinsing process to make sure that that what you don't have is dirt remaining. These are some, as I said, Korea has some beautiful herbals, although this was not necessarily an herbals workshop. These are miniature chrysanthemum flowers, what I've always called the original flowering tea. Nothing more, nothing less. And they're gorgeous. And they open up and they're clear, clean, and just a lovely, lovely, refreshing note. These are both Hwangcha. This is a Hwangcha that is from one of the, I think they're 70 years at this point. 한국제다 is a second generation specialty tea company in Korea. Hwangcha, their Hwangcha is quite excellent. And then this is a Hwangcha I made in Posong 3 years ago, and we kept it there in storage, and it was sent to me to taste. So very quickly, I'm going to show a couple of things. To start any tea, making tea steeping with a tagwan. As with almost all teas, you would want to warm up your vessel. Let's try. So whenever possible, aim is to take tea leaves out without damaging them. And certainly if you're using a tea scoop or spoon where you're going into a tea bag, tea foil or tea caddy to take out, to be ever so gentle with it. So with the steeping styles, most steeping tea, we know we put leaves in, we add hot water. or if we're doing cold steeping or cold brew or ice brew, again, we can either add leaves and put ice on top and let it simply melt and let that infuse. Korean style of steeping also have 3 different ways of steeping, which aren't always used, but it is a wonderful way to really be in touch and feel with the tea and to be able to have a better feel for your ambient temperature and the time of the year. So hatu, jungtu, and sangtu. Hatu is what we would traditionally think of when steeping tea, which is add leaves the way I just did, add leaves and then add hot water, let it steep, and then pour out. Jungtu, hot water, half hot water, leaves, remaining water. Sangtu is when you would add water first and then float the leaves on top. And depending on the time of the year, working with the temperature, it may be warm outside, but you perhaps may have your temperature really, really cold indoors, and then you work with that. Or if you're in a place where it's really humid or really cold or really hot, again, that's one way to work with your leaves and the water temperature. And as with any tea, when it comes to the very basics of steeping tea, is you start with good tea, which means you either know your teas or you trust the source from whom you're getting your teas from. You start with good tea, good water, and water makes a big difference. So the amount of tea, dry leaves, to the amount of water, at what temperature, and how long you pull it for can make the world of a difference of having the most amazing experience in a tea room or a tea shop to come home and replicate and say, what happened? This is not the same tea. Or to be able to truly get to know, get intimate with your tea, get in there, come up with your nose, sticking with wet tea leaves, smell it, hear it, drop the tea leaves onto a piece of paper to hear how it sounds when it hits the top of a paper. Hear how the water sounds. Smell as it's steeping, what the infused leaves taste, smell, feel, and then enjoy the liqueur as well. So there's a late beloved, revered Buddhist monk of his time, one of the most revered, Venerable Babjang, who was not only a revered monk, but a prolific writer and also a lifelong tea drinker, has many books on meditation and poetry. And a simple quote from him, which I've always loved, is what brings happiness? Beauty, moderation, and gratitude. I find great joy in the scent of cup of tea. Really, at the end, it's being able to have harmony with tea, and tea is about connecting. Tea is about human connections, and if you don't know Korean tea, I really hope that you will get a chance to be able to travel there. I hope that at least in our short time together, that we travel to Korea in spirit, and touched a little pieces of different corners of the country, of the tea fields, and the people who are in the tea world and who appreciate and drink tea over there. With each sip, we are in fact connecting ourselves with everybody around the world, certainly in this case with those tea farmers in Korea from Hadong, Jeju-do, Gangjin, Posang, and everywhere else. So with that, I want to say thank you. I really appreciate it at this time. I wish I could see faces. I wish I could be in a room and connect in person. But I wanted to say thank you. If you have any questions in the short time that we have left, I'd be happy to answer or at least entertain them.
One. Marja asked, could you briefly mention what caused the Renaissance in 2003?
So it wasn't that 2003 caused the Renaissance. What happened is the Renaissance, the most current, there's was a little blip in 2007, but the most current renaissance of tea in Korea happened late 60s. It began in the late 60s and early 70s, really when Korea as a nation was able to begin standing on its own post-war and colonialization and the devastation that the country faced as a result. And so that's when the Thains from around the country started coming out of the woodworks, if you will, to say, gosh, if we don't pull our tea culture back together, this may become a gem, a jewel that is forever lost. So in fact, these amazing pioneer tea folks started coming out and meeting in different places in Gwangju, on here and there, and they would meet every 2 weeks or so to say, gosh, okay, so in your district, what was the ceremony style that you were doing? And they began to codify things. Sadly, number of those pioneers have already passed in the last 10 years. And I wish more were being done to make sure that we record all of their stories before more are lost. And so 2003 isn't that something caused it to have renaissance. 2003 is as the world tea renaissance was coming around as well, and the advent of the of social media and easier connections, suddenly tea renaissance in Korea went to a full peak. There was something that happened in 2007 that actually caused it to for the ground under it to shake a bit. But in 2003, that's when tea, you just couldn't um, get enough good teas out of Korea. And Korean tea makers weren't really interested in exporting at that time because there was so much demand. That's also about the time when you began to see importing of teas from other countries. So of course, there was a real high protective tariff on green teas because it was a protected commodity in Korea. But around 2003, before then, if you went to a tea room, you would see only Korean 전통차s, the decoctions and such, as well as the loose leaf teas. But you didn't necessarily see teas from other countries. But around 2003 is when you began to see pour on the menu.
Mm.
And so you might see like one, two things that weren't Korean per se. And as you well know, Sue, at this point, it's
Yeah.
every blended teas just went through the roof. They scented and blended teas and all the companies that are out in Korea. So I hope that answers. Is it Margie? Is that her name?
I hope I said her name correctly, Marja,
Marja?
Mirja. Kaishan asked, is Korean matcha popular among Korean people? Did matcha practice continue or was it like China stopped and forgotten?
Oh gosh, no. So in Korea we call it garunokcha or maicha, not matcha, and it is grown in the same fashion in that the higher grade ceremonial grade are shade grown, and then they are then ground by stone. And so no, matcha production has really done well, and in fact, not only domestically but export wise. Sadly, after the March of, when was it, 2011 with the Fukushima in Japan, there was a lot of concern about the safety of matchas from that region. And I think the benefactor in some ways were the tea companies in Korea that really had high grade matcha production. And so they were able to step in, and I think we're able to serve that need as well as benefit from them. The other thing that is really popular, not just with young people, is all the different latte mixes. So
Yes.
it's not just the ceremonial grade, but the powders have really found its way into all aspects of culinary application. So from the beverage application to the culinary. So it's used in,
Yeah.
every dessert, every and so not just matcha, but things of different kinds of teas that are also like there's a Hongcha mix. There is this kind of right that are all made in a similar fashion, and some are actually doing quite a nice job. Instead of it being all 90+% sugar, sometimes they're only 80% sugar. But yes.
Also with teas and powder, like one of my favorites, mugwort powder in Korea.
What anything mugwort, I'm there. So I have a 돌침대.
Yeah.
I have a hot. It's for those who don't know what a 돌침대 is. Literally, it's rock bed. And the rock bed, I have a rock bed where it's got 2 panels and it has different control. So it's like the best for people with an aching back. You turn one up high and it's like an indoor sauna. And then when it's too hot, you roll over to the other side where it's completely icy cold, and it's wonderful. But what that's also wonderful for is it's great for me to make mugwort tea. A lot of different tea productions that so 돌 침대 heated up on a heated stone works great for basket firing. And so sukcha, yeah, anytime there is baby suk out on the market, they go home with me. So and it goes into my little tea studio and I make sukcha. It's just, yeah. Suk is one of the best things because if you're traveling, you carry suk putum for maksibastion, right? And you can smoke the suk and put it on different parts where it aches you, and it just does wonders. And then you can drink it. So
You can drink it like tea. You can cook. You can
you can cook with it. And one of my favorite is suk duck. Right? It's like
you can make great tea food too, like with
I know.
the tisane. But sukta, like once you are into the flavor
Oh,
and taste, like you
it's
are
just yes.
for it forever.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Yes. And soups with suk is just it's yeah,
Yeah, in spring with fresh magua. I would
right.
love to continue talking and talking, asking questions, but we are getting out of
I know.
loved I loved your presentation and we have many comments, like really great responses. We could go later. Um and look forward to meeting you as well
Me
more
too.
and joining your classes in future, and then look forward to joining your events that you are planning to do.
Come out to Korea. And hopefully you can come on one of the tea and culinary tours
Yes, I
or make tea with me.
will.
Anyway, Sue, thank you. I know this was happenstance the way it happened. I thankfully I had these things with me. Well, I would anyway. So, but I'm so glad we connected. And I'm so glad that I was able to participate in this. And if I've helped in any way to help instill more interest, further an interest, spark an interest about Korean tea, or further someone's journey. About with Korean tea, and that's all I could ask for.
It was a great journey to Korean teas with the Korea Tea Ambassador. It was lovely. Thank you so
Thank
much.
you. I'll be on until I guess 1 a.m. my time.
Lovely.
Take
Thanks.
care. Bye everyone.
Bye.